For most of human history, there were no cities, no kings, and no written laws. The world our ancestors knew was raw, unpredictable, and often brutal. There were no borders, no governments, no guarantees of safety. Every sunrise marked a new test of endurance. This was the era before civilization, a time when survival was not an abstract idea, but the central purpose of existence. Early humans lived in small, close-knit groups, rarely exceeding a few dozen individuals. These bands were bound together by blood, shared experience, and mutual dependence. To be alone was to be vulnerable. To be separated from the group often meant death. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on cooperation. These communities were nomadic. They followed the rhythms of nature, the migration of animals, the ripening of plants, the changing seasons. When resources were exhausted, they moved on. Permanence was impossible in a world where food was never guaranteed. Movement was life. Hunting was one of the most dangerous activities humans ever undertook. Armed with stone-tipped spears, sharpened wooden shafts, and later simple throwing weapons, hunters pursued massive animals many times their size. A wounded mammoth or bison could kill a man with a single strike. Success required planning, patience, and absolute trust in one another. Every hunt was a collective effort, and every failure carried consequences. Yet hunting alone did not sustain these societies. Gathering was equally, if not more, important. Women and children searched the landscape for berries, seeds, roots, nuts, and edible plants. Their understanding of the environment was astonishing. They knew which plants healed wounds, which induced sickness, and which could sustain life through harsh winters. This knowledge was not written. It was memorized, practiced, and passed down through stories and observation. Tools were simple, but they were not crude. Stone blades were carefully shaped. Bone needles were crafted with precision. Wooden handles were smoothed and balanced. Each tool reflected generations of accumulated knowledge. These objects were not possessions in the modern sense. They were necessities, shared and maintained by the group. Shelter was temporary and functional. When caves were available, they offered protection from wind and predators. More often, people built huts from branches, animal hides, and grass. These structures were dismantled and rebuilt as the group moved. Nothing was permanent because permanence was dangerous. At the heart of every camp burned fire. Fire was the greatest technological achievement of the pre-civilized world. It transformed raw food into nourishment, hardened wooden tools, provided light in darkness, and kept predators at bay. Fire extended the day, allowing humans to gather, speak, and think long after sunset. Around fire, community was formed. Socially, these societies were strikingly egalitarian. There were no kings, no bureaucracies, and no formal hierarchies. Leadership was situational, based on experience and skill rather than authority. The best hunter led the hunt. The most knowledgeable elder guided decisions. Power was temporary and conditional. Resources were shared. Hoarding food endangered the group. Cooperation ensured survival. Children were raised collectively, watched over by many eyes. Elders, though physically weaker, were invaluable. They carried memory, knowledge of past disasters, migrations, and survival strategies. In a world without writing, memory was civilization. Despite the harshness of their lives, early humans were not merely surviving. They were thinking, imagining, and creating meaning. Deep within caves, far from sunlight, they painted animals, handprints, and symbols on stone walls. These images were not decoration. They were expressions of belief, identity, and memory. They may have represented rituals, stories, or attempts to influence the natural world. Whatever their purpose, they reveal something profound. The human mind had learned to think symbolically. Language accelerated this transformation. With spoken words, humans could share complex ideas, teach skills, recount experiences, and imagine futures that did not yet exist. Language turned individual experience into collective knowledge. Culture emerged, invisible but powerful. Spirituality likely arose during this period. Death was unavoidable, nature was overwhelming. Early humans sought meaning in a world beyond their control. Burials, rituals, and symbolic art suggest a belief in forces greater than the individual. This search for meaning would later shape religions and civilizations. For tens of thousands of years, this way of life endured. Humans spread across continents, adapting to deserts, forests, tundras, and coastlines. They survived ice ages and mass extinctions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they accumulated knowledge about animals, plants, weather, and themselves. This long, silent era laid the foundatio. For tens of thousands of years, humanity survived through movement. To stay alive meant to adapt, to follow nature rather than control it. But slowly, quietly, a transformation began, one that would change the human story forever. At the end of the last ice age, the world entered a new phase. The climate became warmer and more stable. Glaciers retreated, rivers followed predictable paths, and fertile lands expanded. In several regions of the world, wild grains began to grow abundantly year after year. Animals returned to the same grazing grounds with seasonal regularity. Humans observed these changes. They noticed that seeds dropped into the soil would grow again. They learned that certain plants could be encouraged, protected, and harvested. These discoveries were not sudden revelations, but the result of generations of careful observation and experimentation. At first, nothing seemed revolutionary. People still hunted and gathered. But some groups began returning to the same locations repeatedly. Temporary camps became seasonal settlements. Over time, seasons turned into years, and movement slowed. Humanity began to stay. This shift marked the beginning of agriculture. Early farming was uncertain and fragile. Crops could fail. Floods and droughts could destroy months of labor. Farming demanded long hours of repetitive, exhausting work. Yet it offered something no previous way of life could guarantee: stability. For the first time, humans could produce food instead of merely searching for it. This ability changed everything. Agriculture created surplus. Grain could be stored, animals could be bred. Food could be planned months, even years in advance. Surplus meant security. It also meant growth. Populations increased rapidly. Children survived at higher rates. Settlements expanded. Villages formed. Permanent communities tied to the land. But permanence came with a price. Life as a farmer was physically demanding. Diets became less diverse, relying heavily on a few staple crops. Skeletal evidence shows that early farmers were often shorter, weaker, and more prone to disease than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Living close together allowed infections to spread quickly. Domesticated animals introduced new illnesses. Yet humanity did not return to its old ways. The promise of predictability was too powerful. With settled life came ownership. Fields mattered, harvests mattered, storage buildings mattered. Food was no longer shared automatically. It was guarded, counted, and controlled. This was the birth of property. Surplus created inequality. Some families controlled more land, more grain, more animals. Others had less. Wealth accumulated unevenly. Social differences deepened, and the idea of equality began to fade. As communities grew larger, the old systems of collective decision-making became strained. A small band could decide together. A village of hundreds could not. Leadership emerged. At first, leaders organized labor, managed food storage, and resolved disputes. Over time, their authority became permanent. Power was no longer temporary or situational. It became institutional. Specialization followed. Not everyone needed to farm. Some became craftsmen, toolmakers, traders, or warriors. Others focused on rituals and belief, attempting to explain natural forces and human suffering. Religion gained new importance. When floods destroyed crops or droughts brought famine, people sought meaning. Rituals promised protection. Gods promised order. Temples became centers of authority. Those who claimed to speak for the gods gained power. Villages grew larger. Defensive walls appeared. Competition over land intensified. Conflict became organized. Violence was no longer spontaneous. It was planned. Humanity was no longer living within nature. It was reshaping it. Forests were cleared. Fields expanded. Rivers were redirected. The landscape itself began to change under human control. The agricultural revolution did not occur everywhere at once. Many groups continued hunting and gathering for thousands of years. But once farming appeared, it spread rapidly. The idea was irreversible. Control food, and you control life. This transformation was not a clear victory. It was a trade. Humanity gained stability but lost mobility. It gained growth but sacrificed equality. It gained control but became vulnerable to failure on a massive scale. A single bad harvest could doom an entire community. Yet the path forward could not be abandoned. From farming villages would rise towns, from towns, cities. From cities, laws, kings, and empires. Agriculture created the conditions for civilization, but it also created dependence. Humans were now tied to land, seasons, and systems they could not easily escape. The freedom of movement was gone. In its place stood permanence, hierarchy, and power. Humanity had crossed a threshold. There was no return to the old world of constant movement and shared survival, the agricultural reverie. As agriculture spread and settlements grew, humanity entered a new phase of existence. Permanent villages multiplied across fertile regions, especially along great rivers. These places offered water, fertile soil, and predictable cycles. But they also demanded coordination, planning, and control. Gradually, villages became something entirely new. They became cities. For the first time in human history, large populations lived together in a single permanent location. Hundreds turned into thousands. Familiar faces became strangers. The old systems of kinship and shared memory could no longer hold society together. Something new was required. Cities emerged most clearly in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This region was rich but unstable. Floods could destroy crops without warning. Droughts could bring famine. Survival here depended not only on nature but on organization. To control water, people built canals, dikes, and reservoirs. These systems required collective labor and centralized planning. Someone had to decide when canals were built, who maintained them, and how water was distributed. Administration was born. At the center of early cities stood temples. These were not only religious spaces, but economic and political ones. Temples stored grain, organized labor, and distributed resources. Priests became managers. Religion and administration merged. The gods were believed to own the land. Humans worked it on their behalf. Kings soon followed. Early rulers claimed divine approval. They did not rule by force alone, but by belief. To obey the king was to obey the gods. Authority became sacred, unquestionable, and permanent. This was a radical break from the past. For the first time, power was centralized. Decisions were made by a few and imposed on many. Society became hierarchical. Elites controlled land, resources, and labor. The majority worked to sustain the system. Cities created opportunity, but also inequality. Craft specialization expanded rapidly. Some people became full-time potters, metal workers, scribes, or merchants. Trade networks connected distant regions. Ideas, goods, and technologies moved faster than ever before. But specialization also increased dependence. Farmers depended on rulers for protection. Rulers depended on farmers for food. The system became complex and fragile. With growing populations came new problems. Crime increased. Disputes over land, labor, and resources became common. Old traditions were no longer enough to maintain order. Memory could not regulate thousands of people. Rules were needed. Law emerged as a tool of control. Written laws replaced oral tradition. They defined property, punishment, and social roles. Justice became standardized, but not equal. Laws protected the powerful more than the weak. Punishment depended on status and class. Still, law brought predictability. Civilization became structured. Writing played a crucial role in this transformation. Originally developed to record trade and taxes, writing soon expanded to include laws, prayers, contracts, and history. Memory was externalized. Knowledge could outlive individuals. Civilization could now remember itself. Cities also changed how humans experienced time. Life became regulated by schedules, planting seasons, labor demands, religious festivals. Time was measured, counted, and controlled. Urban life was intense and often harsh. Cities were crowded, disease spread easily. Sanitation was poor, fires and floods were constant threats. Many lived short, difficult lives. Yet cities continued to grow. Why? Because cities offered something no village could: power, protection, and possibility. Behind city walls, people found security from raids. Markets offered goods from distant lands. Temples promised meaning, authority promised order. Civilization demanded sacrifice, but it rewarded ambition. As cities competed, conflict became inevitable. Control over land, water, and trade routes led to war. Armies formed, weapons improved. Violence became organized and systematic. The first states emerged. These early states expanded beyond city walls, conquering neighboring settlements. Tribute replaced cooperation, empire became possible. Yet complexity carried risk. The more complex the system, the more vulnerable it became. Crop failure, rebellion, invasion, or environmental change could collapse an entire civilization. The systems that allowed growth also magnified failure. Still, humanity did not turn back. Cities continued to rise. Civilization reshaped human identity. Individuals became subjects. Roles replaced relationships. Loyalty shifted from family to state, from kinship to law. The world was no longer organized by nature alone. It was organized by human systems. This transformation was neither purely good nor purely destructive. Civilization produced art, architecture, science, and memory. It also produced inequality, exploitation, and war. The first cities were XP. As the first cities stabilized and systems of control took root, a new force began to shape human history. Cities no longer existed in isolation. They looked outward, toward neighboring lands, resources, and people. Competition replaced coexistence. Power demanded expansion. The age of empires was beginning. Early cities depended heavily on their surroundings. They required farmland, water, labor, and trade routes. As populations grew, these needs increased. Peaceful exchange was often not enough. When negotiation failed, force followed. War became an extension of politics. Unlike earlier conflicts between small groups, warfare between cities was organized and deliberate. Armies were formed, trained, and equipped. Leaders planned campaigns. Victory meant land, tribute, and labor. Defeat meant destruction, enslavement, or disappearance. Some cities grew stronger than others. Their rulers learned that controlling neighboring cities was more effective than constantly fighting them. Instead of destroying rivals, they absorbed them. Authority expanded beyond a single city. Empires were born. The first empires united multiple peoples, languages, and cultures under one rule. This required new methods of control. Force alone was not enough. Empires needed administration, communication, and ideology. Rulers claimed divine support for their conquests. Expansion was presented as the will of the gods. Victory proved legitimacy. Religion and empire became inseparable. Bureaucracy expanded rapidly. Officials recorded taxes, land ownership, and labor obligations. Writing became a tool of domination. To be counted was to be controlled. Law followed. Empire uniform legal systems replaced local customs. Law standardized punishment, taxation, and social roles across vast territories. Justice became centralized, but never equal. Empires brought order, but at a cost. For many, imperial rule meant loss of autonomy. Communities that once governed themselves now answered to distant authorities. Tribute was extracted, resistance was punished. Yet empires also created stability. Roads connected regions, trade flourished. Ideas, technologies, and beliefs spread faster than ever before. Empires became engines of exchange, but expansion carried danger. The larger an empire became, the harder it was to control. Communication slowed, corruption spread, loyalty weakened, rebellion became constant. Empires required continual expansion to survive. Without new land and resources, they stagnated. War became permanent, environmental strain increased. Agriculture intensified, land was overworked. Ecosystems weakened, fragility grew beneath the surface. When droughts or climate shifts occurred, the effects were devastating. Famine triggered rebellion, authority collapsed. Empires did not fall quietly. They fractured under pressure from internal decay, external invasion, or environmental crisis. Systems built for control became too rigid to adapt. Cities were abandoned, trade networks collapsed. Knowledge was lost, yet civilization did not disappear. Again and again, new empires rose from the ruins of old ones, repeating familiar patterns. Expansion, control, collapse. Empires reshaped human identity. Individuals became subjects of vast systems. Loyalty shifted from community to ruler. Power became distant and abstract. The age of empires revealed a fundamental truth of civilization. Power expands until it breaks. Empires magnified both human achievement and human failure. They built roads, laws, and monuments. They also produced inequality, suffering, and destruction. Still, humanity continued to build them. Because once power could expand, it always would. Civilization often presents itself as permanent. Cities rise with massive walls, empires stretch across continents, and rulers speak in the language of eternity. To those living within them, civilizations appear unbreakable. But history reveals a different truth. Civilization is not a solid structure. It is a fragile system, constantly balanced between order and collapse. Every civilization depends on complexity. As societies grow, they rely on agriculture, trade, administration, law, military power, and belief systems working together. Each element supports the others. When the system functions smoothly, civilization flourishes. When even one part begins to fail, pressure spreads through the entire structure. Collapse rarely arrives suddenly. More often it begins quietly. Harvests become less reliable, climate patterns shift. Rivers flood unpredictably or dry up. Fields produce less food, but populations remain large. Surplus disappears, scarcity takes its place. Hunger changes everything. When food becomes scarce, social order weakens. Trust in leadership erodes. The promise of protection and stability breaks down. People begin to question authority, tradition, and belief. Laws lose meaning when survival is at stake. Famine is not only a biological crisis, it is a political one. As resources shrink, competition intensifies. Communities fight over land and water. Elites attempt to protect their privileges. Inequality becomes more visible and more dangerous. Those with power hoard resources. Those without rebel. Internal conflict grows. At the same time, external pressures increase. Neighboring groups facing their own crises move toward weakened civilizations. Borders are tested. Raids become invasions. Armies are forced to respond, even as resources to support them decline. Military power becomes a burden. Maintaining soldiers, fortifications, and weapons requires food, labor, and organization. When these fail, armies weaken. Discipline collapses, loyalty fades. Forces meant to protect civilization accelerate its decline. Bureaucracy begins to fail as well. Large systems depend on communication. Orders must travel from the center to the provinces. Taxes must be collected. Laws must be enforced. As instability grows, communication slows, corruption spreads. Officials prioritize survival and personal gain over duty. Authority becomes fragmented. Local leaders act independently. Provinces resist control. Central power loses its reach. Laws remain written but no longer obeyed. Civilization becomes rigid, unable to adapt to rapid change. Rigidity is fatal. Systems designed for stability struggle to respond to crisis. Tradition replaces innovation. Old solutions are applied to new problems. Adaptation slows while pressure increases. Collapse accelerates. Cities suffer first. Trade networks break down. Markets empty, craftsmen lose purpose. Specialists can no longer survive without surplus. Skills disappear as people return to basic survival. Urban centers shrink. Some cities are abandoned entirely. Others survive as shadows of their former selves. Monuments decay. Infrastructure fails. Roads fall into disrepair. Knowledge is lost as writing declines and education collapses. Population declines follow. Disease spreads easily among weakened communities. Malnutrition lowers resistance. Mortality rises. Birth rates fall. Entire regions lose large portions of their population within a few generations. To later observers, collapse appears sudden, but in reality it is the result of long-term strain. Environmental stress, economic inequality, political rigidity, and social fragmentation combine until the system can no longer sustain itself. Collapse is not a single event, it is a process. Yet collapse is not extinction. Even as civilizations fall, humanity endures. Survivors adapt, smaller communities form, new social structures emerge, old ideas mix with new conditions. Memory fragments, but does not vanish completely. Civilization leaves traces, technologies persist, agricultural knowledge survives, stories and beliefs are carried forward. Even ruins shape the future, offering materials, inspiration and warnings. From collapse comes transformation. History shows that collapse clears space. Old systems too rigid to change disappear. New societies arise, often simpler at first but more adaptable. Over time, complexity returns. The cycle begins again. Rise. Expansion. Strain. Collapse. This pattern repeats across continents and centuries. No civilization escapes it. Each believes itself unique. Each believes it has solved the problems of the past. Each eventually faces limits it cannot overcome. The fragility of civilization lies not in human weakness, but in human ambition. The desire to grow, control, and expand creates systems larger than their environment can support. Complexity brings power and vulnerability. Collapse reminds humanity of its limits. It strips away illusion and exposes dependence on that. Civilization is often judged by what it builds. Cities, monuments, laws, and empires are taken as proof of success. They stand as visible symbols of progress, order, and achievement. But the true legacy of civilization lies deeper, not only in stone and writing, but in how it reshaped the human experience. Civilization changed how humans related to time. Before cities, life followed natural rhythms, seasons, migrations, cycles of growth and decay. With civilization came calendars, schedules, and deadlines. Time was measured, divided, and controlled. Workdays replaced seasons. The future became something to plan, not simply endure. This transformation altered the human mind. Civilization also redefined identity. In small communities, identity was personal and relational. One was known by kinship, experience, and memory. In civilizations, identity became abstract. People became subjects, citizens, or workers. Roles replaced relationships. Status replaced familiarity. Belonging expanded, but intimacy diminished. Law and institutions replaced tradition. Rules written by distant authorities governed daily life. Justice became impersonal. Protection was exchanged for obedience. Freedom was limited in exchange for stability. Yet civilization also expanded possibility. Writing preserved knowledge beyond a single lifetime. Ideas could travel across generations and across space. Science, philosophy, and mathematics became possible. Memory was no longer fragile. Civilization could accumulate understanding. Art flourished. Music, architecture, literature, and ritual expressed meaning on scales never before imagined. Civilizations asked questions about existence, morality, and the universe. They sought not only to survive, but to understand. Civilization also transformed power. Authority became centralized and symbolic. Rulers governed through institutions rather than personal presence. Power became invisible, embedded in systems, laws, and norms. This allowed societies to grow, but also made power harder to challenge. Resistance changed form. Rather than confronting individuals, people confronted systems. Obedience became habitual. Control became normalized. Civilization taught humans to regulate themselves. At the same time, civilization deepened inequality. Surplus enabled specialization, but also concentration of wealth. Elites gained access to resources, education, and influence. Others were confined to labor and survival. Opportunity expanded unevenly. This imbalance became structural. Civilization produced comfort for some and hardship for others. Progress was real but uneven. Advancement often depended on exploitation. Growth came at a cost paid by many. Nature too was transformed. Civilization separated humans from their environment. Land became property, rivers became resources, animals became assets. The natural world was no longer a partner in survival, but something to be controlled. This separation created power and vulnerability. Civilization allowed humans to reshape landscapes, but also to damage them. Environmental strain accumulated slowly, often unnoticed. The same systems that enabled growth made collapse possible. Still, humanity continued. Civilization endured because it answered a fundamental human desire, meaning beyond survival. It offered purpose, structure, and continuity. It connected individuals to something larger than themselves. Civilization created shared stories. Myths, histories, and identities bound people across distance and time. Even strangers could belong to the same world. Cooperation on massive scales became possible. The modern world is the result of this legacy. Our cities, technologies, and institutions are extensions of ancient experiments. The questions faced by early civilizations remain unresolved. How much control is too much? How much growth is sustainable? How should power be balanced? Civilization did not solve these problems. It made them permanent. The legacy of civilization is not certainty, but tension between freedom and order, growth and balance, ambition and restraint. It is neither purely a triumph nor purely a failure. Civilization is a tool. It amplifies human potential and human flaws. Its value depends not on what it builds, but on how it is maintained, questioned, and adapted. Without reflection, civilization becomes rigid. Without restraint, it becomes destructive. The future of civilization remains unfinished. It is shaped by choices made every generation. Whether it leads to renewal or collapse depends not on systems alone, but on understanding the lessons of the past. Civilization is not the end of history. It is an ongoing experiment, and humanity is still deciding what it is meant to become. When we look across thousands of years of human history, a striking pattern emerges. Civilizations rise, expand, struggle, and collapse again and again. These cycles are not random. They follow recurring forces that continue to shape the human world. At the heart of history lies repetition. Every civilization begins with solutions to real problems. Food shortages lead to agriculture. Disorder leads to law. Insecurity leads to walls and armies. Each step is logical, necessary, and often successful at first. But solutions create new problems. As systems grow more complex, they demand constant maintenance. Institutions multiply, rules accumulate, control increases. What once solved instability begins to generate rigidity. Flexibility is replaced by tradition. Innovation slows, complexity becomes weight. Civilizations also expand beyond their original limits. Growth brings wealth, influence, and confidence. Expansion feels natural, even inevitable. But expansion stretches systems thin. Distant regions become harder to manage. Resources are consumed faster than they can be renewed. Strain builds quietly. Power concentrates at the center. Decision-making moves farther from everyday life. Rulers rely on abstractions, numbers, reports, laws, instead of direct experience. This distance weakens understanding. Policies lose contact with reality. Disconnection grows. At the same time, inequality deepens. Surplus accumulates unevenly. Elites benefit most from stability and expansion. Those at the margins bear the cost. Tension increases beneath the surface. Eventually, pressure finds release. Sometimes it appears as rebellion, sometimes as invasion, sometimes as environmental crisis. Often, multiple forces converge. Collapse rarely has a single cause. History teaches that warning signs are often ignored. Civilizations tend to believe in their own permanence. Past collapses are seen as failures of others, not as lessons. Confidence replaces caution. Systems continue unchanged, even as conditions deteriorate. Adaptation comes too late, yet these patterns are not signs of human failure alone. They reflect the limits of complexity. Large systems are powerful but fragile. They achieve remarkable coordination and suffer catastrophic breakdowns. Human ambition drives both outcomes. The desire to build, control, and expand is deeply human. It fuels creativity and cooperation. It also creates imbalance. Civilization magnifies intention, whether constructive or destructive. These patterns persist into the modern world. Technology accelerates growth. Systems become global. Interdependence increases, benefits multiply, and risks spread faster than ever before. Collapse, if it comes, will not remain local. History does not repeat exactly, but it echoes. Understanding these patterns does not grant immunity. Knowledge alone does not prevent collapse, but it offers awareness. It allows societies to recognize limits, question assumptions, and reconsider direction. Civilization's future depends on this awareness. Balance must be chosen over endless growth, adaptation over rigidity, cooperation over domination. These choices are not guaranteed. They must be renewed constantly. The patterns of history are not destiny, they are tendencies. Human societies have always shaped their world and been shaped by it in return. The same forces that created ancient civilizations continue to operate today, under new forms and technologies. The story of humanity is not finished. Each generation inherits the structures built by the previous one. Each must decide whether to preserve, reform, or abandon them. Progress is not automatic. Collapse is not inevitable. But the patterns remain. They wait to be understood or repeated. History does not demand obedience. It offers a warning, and the future will reveal whether humanity has learned to listen. The modern world often presents itself as something entirely new. Technology, science, and global systems seem to separate the present from the distant past. Skyscrapers replace temples, data replaces clay tablets, and machines replace muscle. Yet beneath these changes lies a familiar structure. Modern society is not a break from ancient civilization. It is its extension. The same forces that shaped the first cities continue to operate today. Food production, resource control, administration, law, belief, and power remain the foundations of organized life. Only their scale has changed. Agriculture became industry, trade became global, cities became megacities. Complexity increased dramatically. Modern systems depend on continuous energy, uninterrupted supply chains, and constant coordination across vast distances. Food travels thousands of kilometers. Information moves instantly. Decisions made in one place affect millions elsewhere. Efficiency replaced resilience. Just as ancient civilizations relied on stable harvests and functioning irrigation, modern societies rely on electricity, data networks, transportation, and global markets. When these systems work, life feels secure. When they fail, disruption spreads rapidly. The illusion of control grows stronger. Technology creates distance between cause and effect. Environmental damage accumulates slowly, often invisibly. Resource depletion feels abstract. Risk becomes statistical rather than immediate. As a result, warning signs are easy to ignore. Power remains centralized. Although modern societies speak the language of equality, influence concentrates around institutions, corporations, and states. Decision-making often occurs far from those affected by it. Authority becomes technical, legal, and procedural rather than personal. Control becomes invisible. Rules are enforced not only by force, but by systems people depend on. Access replaces permission, algorithms replace judgment. Obedience becomes routine. At the same time, inequality persists. Wealth, security, and opportunity are distributed unevenly. Some benefit enormously from complexity, others bear its costs. Progress exists, but not equally. This imbalance mirrors ancient patterns. Just as early civilizations believed themselves advanced beyond collapse, modern societies often assume permanence. Past failures are studied as history, not as warnings. Growth is treated as necessity. Expansion is normalized. Adaptation slows. Systems optimized for efficiency struggle to respond to sudden change. Crises expose fragility, financial shocks, pandemics, environmental disasters. Recovery depends on cooperation, trust, and flexibility. These qualities are not guaranteed, Yet the modern world also carries unprecedented potential. Knowledge is widely accessible. Communication connects distant communities. Cooperation across cultures is possible on a scale never before achieved. Humanity possesses tools ancient civilizations could not imagine. The question is not capability, it is choice. The ancient experiment continues under new conditions. The same tensions remain: growth versus balance, control versus freedom, complexity versus resilience. Technology amplifies outcomes, both positive and destructive. The future will not be decided by innovation alone. It will be shaped by how humanity understands its past. Ancient civilizations left warnings written in ruins, myths, and collapsed systems. The modern world stands on their foundation, repeating familiar patterns at unprecedented scale. Whether this experiment ends in renewal or collapse depends on awareness. History does not offer certainty, it offers perspective. And in that perspective lies the possibility, not of perfection, but of learning. The modern world is not separate from history. It is history still unfolding. Human history often feels like a force beyond control. Civilizations rise and fall, patterns repeat, systems expand and collapse. From this perspective, humanity appears trapped in a cycle it cannot escape. But history is not only a sequence of events, it is also a record of choices. Civilization
At every stage,
humans made decisions, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. They chose to settle instead of move. They chose to store food instead of share it immediately. They chose hierarchy over equality, control over freedom, growth over balance. Each choice solved a problem. The future of civilization depends on whether humanity recognizes this process. Modern societies possess more knowledge than any civilization before them. The causes of past collapses are no longer mysteries. Climate stress, inequality, rigid systems, overexpansion, these patterns are well documented. The ruins of history speak clearly. The challenge is not ignorance, it is responsibility. Knowledge does not automatically lead to change. Understanding patterns does not guarantee that they will be broken. Humans are capable of repeating mistakes, even when fully aware of their consequences. This is where choice matters. Civilization can continue to pursue endless growth, increasing complexity and centralized control. This path promises short-term stability and long-term risk. It amplifies efficiency while reducing resilience. It postpones collapse, but does not eliminate it. Alternatively, civilization can adapt. Adaptation requires restraint. It requires acknowledging limits, ecological, social, and psychological. It demands systems designed not only for efficiency, but for flexibility and recovery. This is difficult. Complex societies resist change. Institutions protect themselves. Power rarely relinquishes control voluntarily. Short-term incentives often outweigh long-term survival. Yet history shows that adaptation is possible. Societies that survived longest were not the most powerful, but the most flexible. They adjusted to environmental change. They redistributed resources in times of crisis. Responsibility today extends beyond borders. Modern systems are global. Decisions made in one place affect distant communities and future generations. Responsibility is no longer local, it is planetary. This creates a new challenge. Traditional forms of identity and loyalty evolved in small groups. Global civilization requires cooperation at a scale the human mind did not evolve for. Bridging this gap is one of the greatest tests humanity has ever faced. Technology alone can provide tools, but it cannot replace judgment. Systems can optimize behavior, but they cannot define values. The future of civilization is not a technical problem. It is a moral one. What should be prioritized? Growth or sustainability? Control or autonomy? Efficiency or resilience? These questions cannot be avoided. Civilization will continue to shape humanity, whether consciously or not. But the experiment does not end. History does not dictate the future, it informs it. The past offers warnings, not commands. The patterns of civilization reveal tendencies. not destiny. Humanity still possesses agency, limited, constrained, but real. The question is not whether civilization will change. It always does. The question is whether change will come through deliberate choice or through collapse. The future of civilization is not written. It will be shaped by decisions made in moments that often seem ordinary. Policies, priorities, and values chosen today will echo for generations. Civilization began as an experiment in survival. It has become an experiment in responsibility. Whether humanity succeeds will depend not on power or knowledge alone, but on wisdom, the ability to learn, to adapt, and to choose restraint over excess. The story of civilization is still being written. Humanity often looks to history for answers. We search the past for lessons, warnings, and explanations. We study civilizations as if they were completed stories, chapters with clear beginnings and endings. But history is not behind us. It is something we are still inside. From the first hunter-gatherer groups to global civilization, the human story has never truly reset. Each era builds upon the previous one. Each transformation carries forward habits, values, and assumptions formed long before. Civilization did not erase the past. It layered itself on top of it. Beneath modern systems lie ancient instincts, cooperation and competition, fear and ambition, the desire for security and the desire for freedom. These forces shaped early societies, and they continue to shape the present. Human actions now affect entire ecosystems. Mistakes travel faster and last longer. Of lives. The margin for error has narrowed. Yet the core challenge remains unchanged. How should humans live together? Final answer. Every civilization has attempted its own solution. Some prioritized order, others valued freedom. None achieved permanence. History shows that no system is flawless. Every structure creates trade-offs. Every solution generates new tensions. Civilization advances not by perfection, but by adjustment. Sometimes gradual, sometimes forced. Collapse, renewal, and transformation are not anomalies. They are mechanisms. The human story is not one of constant progress, nor one of inevitable failure. It is a process of learning under pressure, of building, breaking, and rebuilding with greater awareness, or repeating the same mistakes with greater power. The future will not be decided by a single invention or ideology. It will be shaped by countless small choices. By how societies respond to stress, by whether power is questioned or obeyed blindly, by whether growth is moderated or pursued without limit. Civilization does not collapse because humans are weak. It collapses when systems outgrow wisdom. The past offers no guarantees, but it offers perspective. It reminds us that complexity demands care, that control has limits, that resilience matters more than dominance. The story of humanity is unfinished. Every generation inherits the consequences of those before it and adds its own layer to the structure. What we build will shape those who come next, just as ancient decisions shape us now. History does not judge, it records. And future historians, if they exist, will look back on this era not as an ending, but as another turning point. Another moment when humanity stood between repetition and change. Civilization began as a response to survival. It became a framework for meaning. Now it stands as a responsibility. The question humanity faces is not whether it will continue to build civilizations. It always will. The question is what kind of civilization it chooses to build, and whether it will remember that it is still part of the story it studies. The human story does not end here. It continues, through choice, consequence, and time.